So our theme this morning is thresholds, transitions, that time and experience of being in between. And we do this time of year in general, and this time in this year in particular, feel in between. We are definitely in between the seasons, or really smack dab in the middle of the season known for change in this constantly fluctuating climate of springtime. Some days, like today, dreary and bitter. Others mild with gentle breezes and sun-kissed clouds against an azure sky. So too are we in between, impatiently awaiting the news or the change or the development that will help us answer the ongoing proverbial question, when will all of this be over? When will we see each other again? When will we feel safe to be in public again? When will our schools open and our parks fill with concerts and picnics and games? We are also in between worlds. The world of several months ago, when folks could believe in the lie that we are separate, could believe that we are not responsible for climate change, could believe that folks halfway around the world couldn't be a threat or a help to us. And as our opening story illustrates, we are at a threshold between what has been and what we just might be able to accomplish. But it is also true that sometimes we have to get sick before we feel better. Now, a couple of things happened this week that I found particularly ironic in the way they were juxtaposed in my world, and both, admittedly, sort of made me feel sick for a bit, at least at first. On Tuesday evening, on a public call with the Unitarian Universalist Association Board of Trustees, the leadership of our religious association decided to recommend that all UU churches prepare to remain closed to the public through May of next year. That's May 2021. Prepare for online services for the next 12 months, they said. Buy that professional Zoom account if you haven't already. We're going to be doing this for a while. But then on Wednesday, the Wisconsin Supreme Court struck down the state's stay-at-home order, essentially opening up the state to business as usual, except for those counties brave enough to withstand the threat of lawsuit to maintain their own restrictions on travel and assembly. And then in the midst of the aftermath of that court decision, on Thursday, the UUA recommendations went public in the form of a letter from our president, Reverend Dr. Susan Frederick Gray. And then I subsequently sat on a Zoom call with our finance committee, scratching my head. Now, I personally felt many different emotions from both these pieces of news. Great sadness at both, of course. Anger at the Supreme Court for not even issuing a stay that might have bridged the gap between isolation policies. Despair that we might not be able to gather in person for a lot longer than I had been hoping. And ultimately some relief that we have at least some explicit and seemingly sane direction from the UUA, if not from the highest judiciary in our land. Now, our board hasn't discussed this yet, though I do imagine it will be a heated topic of conversation when we meet next week. So this isn't officially our policy yet, but it is a reminder of a reality for which we must begin to prepare ourselves. And yet, our state is open for business. Small business owners are now forced into a gruesome and dangerous prisoner's dilemma, where the only way to survive is to open for business because others are open too, regardless of the threat to personal and public health such practice might pose. Yes, indeed, we are in between purported economic self-interest and the health of ourselves and our community. Now, what I like about the UUA recommendation, after, of course, the initial feeling of being sick for sake of the idea of doing remote church for another year, what I like is that it affirms four things, at least four things, that all fall in line with the theology we've professed for generations. First, it says we will not put anyone in danger if we can help it. One of the primary principles of universalism is that we are all children of God. Therefore, we are all deserving of and responsible to love. We are called by our faith to treat everyone as if they are divine, because in truth they are. And that means we simply will not endanger each other's health or lives. Second, it affirms that because some of us are high risk, all of us are high risk. We cannot come back to church until it is safe for everybody to do so. Not just the young or otherwise healthy. No, each and every one of us must be safe in order to worship together. This, too, is an aspirational element of our universalist tradition that we really must leave no one behind. Now, contrast this with the on-the-record statement from Chief Justice Rosensack, who dismissed the deaths related to Wisconsin's meatpacking industry as not affecting regular folks. In universalism, there simply aren't regular folks and irregular folks. There's just folks. Third, the UUA decision to make the recommendation was based on science, trusting the wisdom and knowledge of folks who have dedicated their lives to preventing the spread of disease and coming up with treatments and cures and vaccines and so on. We continue to affirm the use of reason and respect for those who have direct, relevant experience and expertise to help us. Now, fourth and finally, the UUA statement affirms a sentiment that is scattered so thoroughly through our principles, I don't think you can identify it in just one. This is the idea that we are always, whenever humanly possible, we are always committed to being part of the solution rather than continuing to contribute to the problem. Now, we don't always live up to these aspirations, to be fair, and as a people of faith and a faith movement, we've certainly created a few problems of our own. But for the most part, if you look at every social movement for the last 300 years or so, you will see our spiritual ancestors at the forefront, advocating for positive, inclusive change every single time. I like to think that in this time, in this movement, it will be no different. Now, talking about being in between, there's something else that's been happening in this threshold time, this time of inconsistent transition, something I've just started to notice in the last several days. In addition to quickly unfurling ferns sodden from recent and current rains, pops of colorful tulips and bluebells and budding trees, so too have the bugs begun to return. Now, I dislike bugs. Not a big fan. Mosquitoes, ants, moths, murder hornets, not to mention the non-insect varieties with even more legs and pointy parts. Not much for camping either, primarily because of how many bugs the experience usually entails. I've spent much more of my adult life combating bugs that invade my world than cultivating them, for sure. And though generally a pretty gentle person, I can get violent when a rogue spider invades my shower or a buzzing mosquito gets too close to my ear. So when a large package arrived several weeks ago with the notice, "Warning, live insects, open immediately," I didn't even have to look at the label. I knew the parcel was not for me, but for my wife, Kimberly. You see, in the days of COVID-19, we are homeschooling little Miles, who's currently finishing up first grade. And Kimberly, a former public educator herself, is always looking for experiential learning activities to share with Miles. Now, I've learned that when Kimberly and Miles are concerned, experiential learning means dirty. Tromps through muddy woods, spreading compost in a wet garden, splattering wet clay on the floor of the studio, and in this case, raising bugs. Inside the kit was so deftly delivered to our doorstep were 5 tiny caterpillars, a dish with food paste, and a clear plastic and mesh container about the size of a small waste paper basket. The caterpillars were tiny, little dark matchsticks slowly wriggling around their transparent enclosure. They didn't look particularly well, apparently a little stunned from their transit, and it took a bit before they started moving enough for us to accept that they were, in fact, live insects after all. But amazingly, they were alive, and they started to grow quickly. Well, all except for the one who stopped moving pretty quickly that first day. But the other 4 easily doubled in size each of the next several days. Now, it turns out that our house was not perhaps as safe an environment as we might have hoped. Our windows had a habit of blowing over the light enclosure, and our lanky adolescent cat, Oliver, quickly took an interest in our entomological experiment. We had to find ever higher and less accessible places to store the specimens, as it were. Eventually, though, those 4 caterpillars turned into 4 kind of brownish, crunchy-looking things that Kimberly assured us were chrysalises, though only 2 stuck to the top of the case like was in the picture. And these were later deftly dislodged by a pouncing Oliver who was able to leap much higher than we had hoped. And just when we were preparing as parents to break the news to Miles that our experiment hadn't worked and begin quietly disposing of the crumbly remnants, we awoke to, honest to God, there was a butterfly sunning itself in the cage. It took several more days, but 2 more of the chrysalises opened, and 1 more butterfly ultimately emerged into adulthood. Much to our delight, and over the loud protests of Oliver, we released our 2 butterflies this last week. Now, we had initially felt kind of bad that only 2 of our 5 caterpillars made it to flutter off in the Kenosha breeze, but a quick bit of research resulted in the news that in the wild, fewer than 1% of butterfly eggs and no more than 10% of caterpillars actually become butterflies. So our 40% success rate was actually pretty good. Now, I'm still not a very big fan of bugs. I was happy that our project resulted in insects we could release away from the inside of our house, and also relieved to not have to monitor our fuzzy 4-footed predator every time we left the room. But I'll admit the process was fascinating. From the initial and ongoing disappointment and disbelief that any of these creatures would actually make it, to the sadness of losing 3 along the way, to the spectacular feeling of releasing something beautiful, helpful, and alive into this chaotic world, I'm ultimately happy about our butterfly project. And it's hard not to think about transformation, transition, growth, when one may watch over the course of a week the literal metamorphosis of caterpillars into butterflies. It's hard not to think about who we are as a people when our religious leaders seem more concerned about our safety than our political leaders do. But it is comforting, at least for me, that we are continuing to engage in the world despite our physical distance, and that we continue to affirm our universalist truths that we are all important, we are all dependent on and responsible to each other, that we believe in science, and we strive to always be part of the solution. We are indeed on the threshold between what has been and what could possibly be. And if we might ever ground ourselves in love, our future might take flight on gossamer wings toward that crystal blue sky. Go, stand on the threshold, ponder what you will do next, prepare our future, and then fly. We have a brief, quiet video of our butterfly release. Amen.